All right, well, hello everyone. For those of you watching this video, welcome to the Macroeconomics Hours, and hopefully one of those days you'll be able to join us live as well. So today, Hadi and I will be talking about the 2025 Nobel Prize winners, basically the idea of technology and economic growth, and so we've split it. So Hadi will talk about one of the winners. He'll talk about Joel Mokyr, and I'll talk about Aghion and Howitt. So let me start sharing my screen and we'll go from there. All right, and hopefully you're able to see my screen so far. So this year, I think many of us had our money on at least one of those folks, right? My money was on Mokyr for probably quite a few years, but I felt like given the 2024 Nobel Prize decisions, sort of he probably was getting pretty close to that prize. And so this is exactly how it turned out. And so some of the readings that we gave you, the Nobel Prize gives both a summary and a scientific background, which provides a lot more detail. There was an excellent article in VoxEU about the work done by Aghion and Howitt. And there is also an article from The Economist about Joel Mokyr. So that's a fun thing to look at, a fun thing to read. And so I'll talk about two of them, two out of those three folks. But before I do that, I'll give you a couple of graphs that came from the Nobel Prize Committee detailed explanation. So if you look at what was happening in the economic growth in Europe for the first 500 years, this is probably not something to write home about, right? Sort of if you're looking at the GDP per capita, we're starting in 1300s, somewhere a little under 800, right? And 500 years later, 500 years, right, with a lot of ups and downs, but slow trajectory of growth, you're only up to $1,400, right? And the fact that it took half of a millennium to get there, that sort of shows to you that Middle Ages were not a great time to live in, generally speaking, right? Economic growth was terrible. On the other hand, if you look at the real GDP per capita between 1800 and 2000s, and look at a couple of countries that have done the best probably in this regard, at the United Kingdom and the United States, the growth is absolutely astonishing over those two centuries. And we're seeing some ups and downs, but still, we're starting in both United Kingdom and the United States at a number a little greater than 2000, right? Sort of, and again, this is logarithmic growth, so that's probably about what 3000 in there or something like that, right? And we're getting to the numbers now in the United States exceed $50,000 by 2018. Sort of this growth is very, very incredible, and compared to the growth of the previous 500 years, obviously shows to you a very big difference. And so, and the story here is intricately tied to technological progress, right? And this is where this Nobel Prize came from. So if I look at the roots of one half of the prize, so Aghion and Howitt, so what we are seeing is that overall importance of technology was recognized in the economics profession. So since a while ago, right? If you look at Robert Solow's growth accounting method, so he said that it's driven by technology, right? You cannot count on the growth in your labor, you cannot count in the growth of your capital. You have to have a magic component to this recipe, which is technology, really. If you look at the work done by Paul Romer, and both of those actually earned Nobel Prizes too for their work. So in the early 1990s, he wrote a few papers that provided formal theories of knowledge accumulation, the non-arrival nature of knowledge, and non-arrival here is used kind of like in the same way that we talk about public goods. So the benefit of knowledge to you doesn't take away from the benefit of knowledge to somebody else. Going, of course, back to the theory of creative destruction, this theory is not new. So this was proposed by Joseph Schumpeter in 1942. who explained how innovations will impact older technologies, firms, and industries, and how it contributes to the business cycle, right? He noted that it was a highly disruptive process, essentially. And what firms and innovation, sort of he viewed innovation as sort of a business stealing of sorts, right? Without necessarily a negative connotation. One firm gains something, but it also destroys the rents that are enjoyed by other more established firms in the industry, right? And so innovations will destroy companies, products, and jobs, but they will also create new ones and hopefully better ones. And this is the process that's the key to long-term economic growth and to increase in the living standards. And if you go into examples here, examples are numerous. If you look at railroads, cars, computers, digital photography, internet, smartphones, ride sharing, lots and lots of examples that you can think about. When Henry Ford came with the idea of producing a car in a factory, it destroyed other industries it destroyed many other jobs like buggy drivers, right? But it created a lot of efficiency, it created a lot of economic growth, and this creative destruction process, of course, you don't want to be on the end of this process where your job is being destroyed, but that's one of those trade-offs. And so Schumpeter's theory basically was largely, sort of a qualitative theory, right? And so what Aghion and Howitt did, and actually before I do that, let me just talk about the extension, the connection rather to the 2024 Nobel Prize. So we've talked about that last year. That was one of our sessions. Semoglu and Robinson did their work on the institutions and prosperity. And one of the explanation of why some countries don't grow, but they stagnate and decline is when ruling elites block creative destruction by protecting existing industries, right? And so I think that's a fantastic connection. And overall, Semoglu and Robinson talked about how institutions could be both an incentive and a constraint to innovation, and thus an incentive and a constraint to economic growth. But back to Aghion and Howitt's work. So what they did is Schumpeter's theory was largely qualitative, as I said. And so the role that they played was in formalizing and quantifying what Schumpeter had done. So they basically did so within the endogenous or internal, right? Endogenous is a fancy word for internal growth framework, where long-term growth essentially is sourced from innovations that happen at a level of a given firm, and that those innovations displace older technologies. And they connected dynamics at a firm level, such as entry and exit, engagement and innovation, their research and development, to productivity, firm turnover, and aggregate growth. And that in turn gave rise to quite a bit of both empirical and theoretical literature that built on that foundation. And so from the perspective of policy, so there is a number of interesting implications that we can discuss there as connected to their work. So these are the implications about engaging in research and development, industrial policy, so how market is structured and how firms in the market in a given industry are financed, and of course the trade-offs between short-term pain and higher long-term gains, such as higher living standards. And so I'll give you a few of those policy questions shortly in a little more detail. But meanwhile, let me kind of go on to the big picture. And sort of the big picture that comes from Aghion and Howitt's work is that growth essentially is a result of occasional quality improving innovations, right? Sort of this is not necessarily a continuous process, but you can see the spikes in those innovations. And those innovations can permanently raise productivity in a given industry. And if you are able to do something like that, you will be able to enjoy at least temporary monopoly profits while you're being protected, for example, by patents, right? Because in nearly every nearly every country in the world, there is a system of intellectual property protections. And so those temporary monopoly profits, you'll enjoy them for a while, but not for a very long time. Um, there's going to be a displacement by another innovation. That's pretty much a given. We don't necessarily know when it is going to happen, but we know that it will happen. And this is essentially the process of creative destruction. You have you have our business field. So you have the economy continuously shaped by this destruction and creation that takes place. And this contributes to the economic cycle, of course, but it also contributes to the long-term economic growth, similar to what we've seen in the United States and in the United Kingdom over a past couple of centuries. And so before I turn it over to Hadi to talk a little more about the work that was done by Joel Mokyr, and by the way, Joel Mokyr is probably one of my favorite economists. One of the qualities that he has is that he writes exceptionally well, and he writes in a way that is quite well understood by a lay audience, right? Sort of, he's not an economist who hides in complex formulas and things like that. And reading his work is probably something that kind of turned me, at least partially, to the economics profession, and sort of made me think about going to graduate school for it. But anyway, let me go back to some of the policy questions. And so policy questions here, there are a myriad of those, right? So one of them could be about appropriate way to structure incentives for research and development. Another one is whether the governments should be active in industrial policy creation and enforcement like China had done, right? And if so, how exactly something like that should be pursued? A big question in here is about how you help balance that short-term pain that is felt by individual firm and individual workers who lose their jobs versus this long-term growth, right? Sort of essentially, how can you support the workers who are going through the through that creative destruction process? If your job goes away, that's going to be extremely painful to you. And it's lovely to think that overall you're contributing to the long-term economic growth, but still on an individual level, you've got to survive somehow. And sort of the question is, how could the government potentially contribute to this better survival process, to the employee retraining, to helping them acquire new skills, right? So another big question here for me is about how you appropriately structure the human capital accumulation programs. And human capital accumulation programs, you're talking about things here like bachelor's degrees, right? Like graduate degrees, so the formal higher education structure. But also we could be talking about human capital accumulation that takes place during one's employment, right? Sort of we can talk about potential decisions about supporting those accumulation programs, right? Like, do we essentially try to help short-term training programs come into place, right? How do we measure how effective they are? How do we avoid some of the crises that could occur? Because if you remember, like 5 years ago, coding academies were all the rage as a solution to all of the higher education problems, right? Sort of, I swear every time I opened the Chronicle of Higher Education, there was an article there about Coding Academy and their exceptional outcomes in terms of placement. Sorry about that, about placement of their graduates after, maybe being there for a few months, right? But nowadays with generative AI programs that can effectively do much of the basic level coding for you, a lot of those graduates are really suffering, right? And that cycle took place exceptionally quickly within, 5 to 7 years or so. You can talk about the government's approaches to supporting both basic and applied research and supporting the institutions who do that are often the universities, but also, of course, the firms in the economy, and what the right mix should be about supporting basic research versus applied research, right? Remember, basic research is something that theoretically can benefit everyone, right? Applied research is something that is very specific to a potential product and very often to an industry or even to some firms in the industry. Another question here could be, how do you structure intellectual property protections, right? So intellectual property is one of those thorny questions that's really interesting to us because, hey, sort of this serves as an incentive for a firm to engage in innovation. Because if you're spending hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on the research, how do you make sure that once you invent something, somebody just doesn't take it away from you, right? If you're looking at the pharmaceutical industry, there has been a lot of public health advancement in that field over the last 10, 15 years. But then in the United States, intellectual property protections are extremely high. And so once you've discovered a successful drug, you can enjoy monopoly profits on it for a very long time. And that has the potential to essentially hurt folks who are unable to afford those very high prices, right? And so finding the right balance between, should we be giving out patents for 10 years versus 5 years? Should we have a structure where any given pharmaceutical firm has significant potential to slow down production of generics even after the patent protections expires? So all of that is very significant. And sort of another large question is about overall structure of your taxation system, right? How do you incentivize innovation and long-term economic growth? And I'll just end my part of the presentation with one of my favorite quotes by Paul Romer. He said that in relation to a different issue, but a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so the creative destruction process basically makes sure that no crisis goes to waste, right? So that's it for me, folks. So this was a relatively short discussion. And before I give the reins of the presentation to Hadi, I am happy to take any of the questions that you might have had. So if there is something you wanted to ask, please unmute yourself. You can raise your hand if that works better for you. So anything from the audience?
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
If anybody else is asking. So with the creative destruction, I feel like even when I was going through elementary school, everyone was saying that robots were going to replace your jobs. And now I think we're actually at the point where robots might replace jobs for very basic. I feel bad for anybody who has an adult child on the spectrum, and they can do very basic jobs, but I think automation might take those away. Do you have any, I don't know, any research to show that, other jobs might be created for low-skilled workers?
Yeah, I can't think about anything right out of my head right now, but you're absolutely right. Sort of this is something that we've seen, sort of repeat over the years, and things that we consider to be kind of like relatively basic skills right now. I mean, if you looked 50 years ago, they actually might have been, more advanced skills in some of the cases, right? So
Right.
there is no question that the process of creative destruction will create new jobs, but those new jobs very often would require higher levels of human capital. And there is a real concern that folks who are, for any reason, unable to get to that higher level of human capital, might be left behind. And this is one of the unsolved policy questions, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hadi, anything?
Let me add a little bit to this discussion. The Nobel Prize winner of last year, Simone, actually has done some research on how AI may affect employment. And he argues that at most in the next 10 years, we're going to see 20% of jobs being affected negatively by AI. In some cases, in fact, the impact is positive because it adds to the productivity of each individual. You can save time by going to ChatGPT and typing a question there that takes sometimes for collecting information and deciding what it means. It may take you hours, but it does it for you in a few minutes or seconds. So, but about 5% in the next few years might be affected. So he figures that this impact is not going to be as large as being something that you should worry about.
Yeah, we'll have to see how this evolves, right? Because this is an interesting prediction. But at the very same time, I think if you look at the jobs themselves, sort of if you look at the duties or typical tasks that you engage in, and how many of those tasks have evolved over the years, right? So that there's going to be a lot more jobs where the evolution is going to be very, very significant. Even if you look at teaching, for example, and compare teaching, say, 30 years ago versus teaching now, we've gone a long way from basically using your typical sage on the stage structure and your blackboard and writing with chalk. And I remember my dissertation advisor is complaining that she basically developed arthritis in her hands because she used chalk all of the time, right? Sort of her right hand was impacted. And so teaching now looks sort of it has evolved significantly where it's not totally different, but a lot of the skills that may have been in demand 30, 40 years ago would not necessarily be skills in demand now. And the mix of teaching itself has changed, right? Sort of we've seen a significant decline of things like humanities and a greater emphasis on more applied teaching in service to industry, I think.
And our own program is an example of creative destruction.
It is, right? Sort of, we've had, sort of a relatively successful MBA program that was in person. We had, probably even more successful executive MBA programs. But those programs were essentially destroyed by the iMBA and iDegree programs, right? It was kind of like a bittersweet moment of that evolution. And actually, I think because the outcry was so hard, sort of was so harsh, is that the even kind of postponed discontinuing our residential MBA program by a couple of years, essentially.
Okay. Let's see whether there are other questions. All right. If there's none, then I'll go online. I'll share my screen. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now. Okay. What I want to talk about is essentially continuation of what Vlad talked about, looking at long-term economic growth. What we know is that there has been growth since around 1800, much faster than in the past. And what we really want to know is what happened, how it happened, and why. The reading for this is the article that Vlad also talked about by Joel Mokyr. The title of the article is Mokyr deserves his Nobel Prize. Okay, let me show you a graph. This is basically putting together the slides about economic growth experience that Vlad shared with us. And it shows that essentially around 1800, something happened, something fundamental happened that changed the world. Economic growth after this went up and it raised incomes, real incomes, very sharply. Initially, there were European countries and the US that started, but then other countries joined in, and nowadays India and China are countries that are really leading this growth around the world. And Japan, which nowadays, of course, is slowed down in terms of growing, but it also took off in the mid 1800s. This picture gives you the question of what we know or what we don't know. We know rather well what happened. We have measured economic growth over time and across countries, and we also know relatively well where it happened and where economic growth did not happen. And we have developed models that give us good ideas how economic growth happens. And this is essentially what economic growth models do. And the Aghion Howitt model, in fact, is a very good example of understanding how economic growth happens. The model says that creative destruction drives economic growth. And that has, along with many other models, has enabled us to understand how the process unfolds. What remains to be understood much better is the mystery, is why economic growth happens. Here's a couple of questions that give you an idea of why this is a mystery. When creative destruction, why creative destruction started working after 18th century and not before that? What was it about 18th century, at end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century that made it different? Another question is across countries. Why some countries manage to use creative destruction to grow and other countries were left behind? Why is it that in some African countries or Central Asian countries, the creative destruction doesn't work or hasn't worked yet? So these are the key questions that you need to understand in order to be able to come up with better policies, find ways that bring growth to most countries and also allows countries that are already growing to sustain their economic growth. So let's focus on, we already have talked about what happened, and also the models, as I told you, tell us how it happened. Now the question is why. There are many theories that try to explain the beginning of economic growth. Most of them are either irrefutable, means that they don't provide any means for you to test something. For example, if somebody says God wanted US to grow fast, and that's happened, you can't prove or disprove this. So some theories are irrefutable, but are not very helpful, or are implausible, meaning that they don't match the observations that we have. The examples of this is explaining economic growth rates on race of the people in the country or their gene heritage, which doesn't seem to be really relevant. Another possibility is that maybe climate makes a difference, especially some people focus on tropics versus moderate zone on Earth. And the idea here is that maybe in tropics, the weather is warmer and people either become lazier or it's harder to work, or maybe they suffer from some problems that is specific to the tropical climate. And moderate zones or even northern areas where colder people are motivated to work harder. I don't think this also makes sense. To give you a reputation of this, just think about the Mexican border, Mexico-US border. Incomes jump up by multi-fold if you move from northern Mexico to across the border to the US. And this difference between US and Canadian and Mexican standards of living is very visible at the border. So it can't be climate or location on Earth that matters. There are other theories that are a bit more plausible or much more plausible. One example is geography. Location, topology of the country is mountainous, it is flat, that is good for agriculture, has the right kind of resources and the kind of land that is productive or not, market size, how many people are nearby or in vicinity of a location where you have access to larger market, for example. So those things are probably matter in terms of bringing about economic growth. The second type of theory is the institutions, this is what Mokyr and Robinson had done, as Blood mentioned, and also have become much more accepted nowadays among economists that institutions matter. Governance, the rules that you make, so who makes the decisions and how decisions are made. Social institutions, what sort of structure the society has. Politics, for example, is it democracy? What type of democracy? Is it dictatorship? What type of dictatorship, etc. Or legal structures, for example, how law is made and revised. So all these things, the institutionalists argue that these matter and these things help shape economic growth. The last one, which is the work of Joel Mokyr, and typically he has been a leading figure in this area, and that's why he deserves the Nobel Prize in economics, is the issue of culture, which he defined as a socialist transmitted system of beliefs, values, and attitudes that shape how people think and make decisions, especially regarding creation and acquisition of knowledge and how they look at progress, economic growth. That's his argument, that attitudes of people matter a lot. So let's see how the institute. He must say that Mokyr does not deny that institutions matter or geography matters. In fact, he sees institutions and culture as complementary. So I'm going to come back and discuss which one of these might be more important in this determining economic growth and the start of economic growth in the country. So, but right now I'm going to focus on institutions and culture and see how they work. Institutions and culture structures how people interact with each other. They determine incentives. For example, if you have a judiciary, but it's not independent, it's essentially driven by political consideration, that could actually rule out economic growth because contracts, property rights, etc., can't be enforced. Then judiciary is weak, and is not independent. Absence of an independent or an effective judiciary can have major consequences for economic growth. So that's an institution that needs to be there. In terms of culture, for example, think about a situation where people don't trust the government. And that really ties the hands of politicians and policymakers. Because if people don't trust the government, they're not going to accept anything that benefits them less than the elite of the country. Or even if the policy may be in principle a good policy, it may never be implemented because people that demand but for example, price control, demand the government bring about price control, or they may be hiding their income so that they don't pay taxes to politicians in their belief, in the belief of the individual or the population might take their taxes and use it for wasteful purposes or for expropriate the money or appropriate the money in the wrong direction. Let me give you an example from my home country that might actually make this very clear. In Iran right now, gasoline is sold at about 3 cents per gallon. 3 cents per gallon, compared with the US price. You might ask, how is this possible? Because it costs a lot more to extract the oil and distribute it, and distill it and then distribute it. But why doesn't the government raise the price so that people don't waste gasoline? In fact, gasoline is much cheaper than water and many other items. It's probably the cheapest thing in relative terms than anything else. On top of this, the amount of subsidy that the government is indirect by keeping price so low. The amount of money that they transfer to the population is about 1/5 of GDP. 20% of GDP is spent on subsidies on one item, gasoline. It also has created massive smuggling. If you can buy gasoline for 3 cents per gallon, then in neighboring countries, the price is something like $2 or $2.50. The amount of money you can make by smuggling gasoline is enormous. And lo and behold, at the borders, Iran's borders, this is a major source of income for people who smuggle across the border. Take gasoline, buy gasoline in Iran and sell it in Iraq or in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Obviously, the prices need to be adjusted, but every time the government has tried to raise the price of gasoline, there has been a set of demonstrations, riots, and political confrontation with the broad segments of the population. And the reason people don't accept any increase in price that because they think that any that they give to the government or allow the government to charge them is going to go to waste. Somebody's going to steal it or in the government, or somebody is going to use it for useless purposes. And that has become a confrontation between the public and the government that continues and prevents any decision on raising the price. In fact, last 5 years, the price has remained constant, while inflation has been in the order of 40 to 50%. And that's how, and the dollar, also the price of the dollar in free market has jumped up sharply. And that is why gasoline is so cheap in Iran. So this is partly dependent on on the institutions of the country, but some of it also comes from a cultural attitude that they don't trust the government, and therefore, if the government wants to tax them or raise any price, a lot of people come to the streets and demonstrate and make it difficult for the government to govern or to survive. Now, let me connect the idea of institutions and culture to the discussion that Rob presented. Innovation and economic growth through creative destruction. The heart of creative destruction is innovation. You need an innovation to. Innovation is basically the way they work is that they bring in new technology, new way of doing work that can then drive out the old technology because it becomes obsolete, and the new technology comes to dominate the economy. And after a while, another set of innovations drive the economy. That's the heart of economic growth. Without innovation, economic models show, and in fact, experience also shows that the economy cannot grow long term. It may be able to grow short term for a few years, but long term, it's only innovation that matters. But innovations that are the creative part of the destruction benefits people who have innovated. It also causes trouble for those who are losing, the industries, firms that are on the wrong side of the market, using traditional technology or the existing technology rather than the innovation. Those sectors, parts of the economy, whether they're owners of those assets or workers in those kinds of firms, they lose something, and they are going to try to block innovations in order to protect their incomes and profits. Using firms therefore have an incentive to resist change. Creative destruction cannot work, and innovation cannot take place if individuals do not have open access to the economy's resources and markets and are not tolerated. So attitudes towards competition, free expression of ideas, application of knowledge and technology to the production process, those are critical for making creative destruction work. And one of the key problems that one sees in developing countries that have not managed to start or enter a process of long-term growth is the limitations on how much innovator can actually benefit from the result of his or her work. Either ideas are killed before they become functional, or application of knowledge and technology production processes blocked, or the assets of those who come in and innovate are expropriated so that incentive to innovate goes away. So the attitudes, as I said, are important. And what Mokyr does is that he argues that a culture that includes that has characteristics that allows competition to take place, ideas to be expressed, and knowledge and technology be used in production, that kind of culture can allow creative destruction to work and to let the economy grow. And he shows in his book about culture and the culture of growth. That's what his book. He argues that around 1800, so what was significant about that? There was a tradition of intellectual tradition, and the idea of tolerating new ideas became much more common in 18th century, and that prepared the ground for the takeoff of the economy after 1800. The other thing that is important is he believes that culture is more fundamental than institutions. And that's why he thinks that the ultimate driver of innovation and economic progress is culture. Institutions also matter in his view, but not as much as the culture, because he thinks, in fact, institutions are built on the foundation of a culture that is tolerates, allows or encourages productivity, encourages innovation, and prevents those who want to stop the process from messing up or disrupting economic growth. All right, so this is the end of my presentation. We can discuss any points that are not clear now. Okay.
Hey, Professor, thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Thank
And
you.
I really enjoy knowing all that. That's wonderful. I have a question regarding the timing. You says that 1800, I'm sorry, is when things started to change, right?
Right, that's when you notice the change.
Right, notice the change. Were there any catalysts towards that change? And also, I kept thinking about globalization. Was there any coincidence or parallel events that happened to
That's an
globalization?
excellent question. That's an excellent question. In terms of what happened that people changed their attitudes, the origin of that, as Mokyr shows in his book, goes back to at the end of Middle Ages, from 1300 onward. He shows that people started looking at things differently. They started accepting new ideas, and there were people like Galileo, who came up with new ideas, or Copernicus, about the universe, about the world. And that initially was rejected, but established forces like the church, for example, Catholic Church, tried to resist these changes, but eventually people in Europe managed to realize that they need to allow people to express their ideas, do the innovations. In other words, there was much more tolerance of new ideas. And from what I understand, the reason why this happened in Europe and not in the rest of the world is that in Europe, power was always diffused. It was not that much centralized. And feudal lords in Europe had a lot more autonomy than their counterparts had in other parts of the world that could have entered economic growth similar to Europe, for example, Middle East or China. In terms of, if you look at the incomes of average person in China, Middle East, and Europe in around 1500, they're not that different. But comes 1800, and some countries continue with low growth or no growth, and European countries start growing very rapidly. And the idea is that the form of ownership of land and political structures that it has created gave rise to multiple sources of power, and that multiplicity created a space for people to come in, innovate, and access resources much more easily. So that's the explanation for why and how culture started changing in Europe and gave rise to space for innovation. Did I get all your questions, or?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just kept thinking about globalization too,
Oh, yes,
because
globalization also. Maybe I should also mention that there were some events that made a difference. For example, economic historians argue that glorious revolution in UK, in Britain, or in England, made a difference in terms of what happened next, because power was taken from the king and allowed parliaments to shape, so they would act like a check and balance against kings, and that generated the possibility that the king could commit himself to, or the monarch, whoever, a man or a woman, they could commit to pay back debts, and that allowed financial markets to grow much faster in UK. So now, what's the connection of this to international trade? Once economic growth started in UK, having access to other markets, bigger markets, became a major issue. And so the countries that were engaged in trade could actually import the inputs that they needed for the production process and also sell their products in other countries. They had access to bigger markets. The incentive to innovate increased sharply, and that led to much relatively free trade and sort of globalization in the 19th century, which is comparable, or maybe even in some ways was freer than the globalization that we experienced between 1980s and recently, that we're going back to Stone Age.
So Heidi, we have an interesting comment in the chat from Lucy, who mentions that culture of innovation includes people willing to invest money in other people's new ideas and enabling innovators to make mistakes and still try again. And that's something that the United States does pretty well, right? And here there are interesting connections to a couple of concepts. One of them is the concept of corporation being an entity separate from the owners, right? And sort of something that essentially originated in Europe, right, and took place in Europe, sort of like from the very birth of those ancient corporations that united different artisans and so on and so forth, right? And the idea of bankruptcy laws, right, where sort of if your corporation declares the bankruptcy, doesn't necessarily affect you personally all that much, and so you have that opportunity to try again. And sort of we've come a long way in our bankruptcy laws, sort of as compared to the debtors' prisons, right? Where if you owed money to somebody and you couldn't pay up, you would go to prison and potentially spend a good amount of time in there, if maybe, in some egregious cases for the rest of your life, right? Sort of, and those sorts of things helped quite a bit too.
Right. No, that's a great comment and discussion, very nice discussion. Definitely, rules like institutions like bankruptcy laws are absolutely important in terms of encouraging innovation or discouraging. If debtors go to jail, this is one of those puzzled that at some point somebody had thought that if you owe something, you need to go to jail. Because if you go to jail, you can't produce anything. So who benefits? Nobody. This is a lose-lose game. And despite that, you see, this is it used to be common that people would go to jail for not being able to pay back. And again, an example from Iran. Yesterday, in fact, in the parliament, they were discussing to prevent some people going to jail because of debt to their spouses. In Iran, men usually commit to pay some amount of money to their wives, and if women can demand that money whenever they want. Normally, it's not paid at the time of marriage. It's usually paid if they divorce. But the women don't have to divorce to ask for that money. It's their money. And sometimes women want to get rid of their husbands. They go and complain to the court that my husband is not paying me this upfront money that he has promised. And then if the guy can't pay, he has to go to jail.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach for sure. And and also something that sort of we've kind of talked like you mentioned that sort of Europe was maybe a bit of a unique place in terms of how in terms of the rise of constitutional monarchies essentially, right? Like happened in the UK, after they chopped off one of their king's heads, right? Um, so that sort of gave rise to the idea of constitutional monarchy. That also happened in several other European countries, right, where we went from the despotism to constitutional monarchies. And so you had sort of this area that had so many little countries or little principalities or whatever you call them, and you could literally throw a stone from one of them, and the stone would land in a different one. And so that created an interesting laboratory of innovation in there and a lot of competition for the rulers. And one of the interesting things that I just kind of like realized literally in the last couple of months as I was listening to a couple of interesting podcasts about the history of Italy and history of Germany is that in Europe a number of rulers' positions, they were not necessarily hereditary positions, right? Some of them were elected, and of course, it's not like they're not elected by the popular vote or anything like that. But still, it was an interesting setting that could potentially contribute to better governance practices and better institutions and better culture that could support innovation better.
Professor, what do you think the role of colonization, right? Uh, when I saw that graph around 1800, there was an uptick. And to add to Lucy's question, I think colonization did play a role in that uptick. That could be one of the catalysts, I believe, because the colonial powers, they had access to the resources from wherever they were, occupying powers, and that probably helped them, uh, basically increase the per capita GDP, which was shown in your graph.
That's a very good question. You're right. Colonization and colonialism has played a key role in economic history of the world in terms of shifting resources or taking resources from countries that were behind and they're colonized to the mother country, to the colonizer country. Examples of this in case of India, for example, is pretty vivid. The British made sure that, for example, garment industry is not in India doesn't become a competitor to their garment industry or textile industry in UK. So that played a very important role in all this. And in fact, if you go back to the contributions of Arsenal and his associates, they show that there were two types of colonization. One type of colonization is that colonizers would go and establish a new government, maybe a colonial government in an area like the United States. And then because they moved in large numbers from the mother country, at some point they felt that they actually need to set up their own institutions, and the way they set up their institutions was inclusive. Everybody had the right. Every citizen of the country had the right to be considered as equals to others, and that created the ground, or there is the ground for building for power to be diffused, and therefore nobody could actually dominate the whole picture. But in some other places, when Europeans went and tried to settle, they discovered that too many of them are dying as a result of local diseases that were not common in the temperate zone in Europe. And therefore, they decided not to settle there, especially when there was already a large population of natives in that place. And the result of that was that the kind of colonial government that they set up was extractive, meaning that they tried to take as much resources as they could from the colonized country to back to the colonizing country. And Atamoglu and associates explain the differences in economic growth across countries that were colonized in this way. Inclusive institutions versus extractive institutions.
And so those examples would be, sort of something that was an extractive institution was probably the colonies established by Belgium, right? Or maybe by the king of the Belgians, where the colonies were actually not necessarily the property of Belgium itself as a state, but the personal property of the king. And sort of the extraction of resources that took place was done on a horrifying level, especially considering the millions of people natives who died in the process. And so that's kind of like one end of the spectrum. And maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you could make a case that sort of like colonies by the UK would be much more of the other sort of other flavor, where the emphasis was on establishing institutions and bringing sort of innovations and governance like bureaucracy to them, right? And that's, for example, what the United Kingdom was quite famous for in terms of its colonial approach.
That's why, for example, Australia and New Zealand, they inherited, essentially, they took institutions from UK and reproduced it in their own country, because people who lived in the non-natives who moved to Australia, for example, there were a lot of them happened to be convicts initially. But when they tried to form their own government, they made it similar to the government of the UK and put in institutions similar to them, and had the similar cultural background. As a result, they managed to become developed. While in Nigeria, for example, UK government had no intention of developing Nigeria. They just wanted the oil.
All right, folks, any other questions or comments? We are a little after 2 p.m. Go ahead.
This might be for next time. So thank you again. Always very, very interesting, all the contents, all the discussions. Previously, we talked about the research and development, innovation and all that, and how that is also instituted in our education system, and how the government plays a role. And recently, I've heard a lot of discussions about how the government should re-underwrite how they provide student loans, and even people describe those student loans are not good investments and just a big waste of government taxpayers' money, because a lot of that kind of degrees is not producing anything. I don't know. I feel like the discussion is very interesting in a sense that it makes education kind of like an investment and for profit only. And I'm not so sure if that's how education should be provided. But anyway, I think maybe it will be the discussion for next time.
It's a good topic. That's a very good topic.
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent topic for sure.
In fact, my thinking on this, just briefly, I want to say that is that people should not be excluded from getting higher education and progressing towards from higher degrees and building knowledge just because their parents are poor or they themselves are poor. And that's what is the purpose of all these policies like student loans, etc.
Maybe for next time. I'd like to hear what you guys think about it and say about that. Thank you. Cool. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all for joining us. It's much appreciated. So, as always, we welcome suggestions for future topics. And hopefully we'll see you in December. So, I'll post the recording to the YouTube shortly. And meanwhile, if you enjoyed the session, please tell your friends, right? Click and subscribe. Thanks all. Appreciate seeing you, and keep warm.
Thank you.
If I sounded like a social media, influencer.
That's right. All right. Bye for now.
Okay, bye.